All right, everybody, we are live for another episode of the Perceptive podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I am Josh Placer, and we have another developer interview lined up this week. My guest is currently working on the roguelike Scholar of the Arcane Arts, and they are here to talk about the game as well as the kind of systemic approach they're taking to building the various abilities, spells, and whatnot. So, with that said, please welcome to the cast, Indo. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's nice to be here. Been a big fan of these interviews, so it's exciting for me.
Not a problem. And thank you for reaching out and wanting to come on and talk about your game. As I always say to developers, I'm always looking for guests. So if you are watching this and have a game you'd like to talk about or just hang out and chat design, definitely feel free to reach out to me. But it's great to have you on in this somewhat hot April afternoon, at least here in New Jersey. How's everything for you?
And it's a little warm. I'm up in Boston, so it's not as bad, but doing good.
We shall see how bad this, I guess, spring slash summer is going to be this year. So I'm expecting this fan to get even heavier or higher above me. But it is great to have you on. So, as I said a minute ago, you are currently working on the game Scholar of the Arcane Arts. Since this is your first time on the cast, and for people watching us live or recorded, could you talk a little bit about who you are, your general background, and of course, give us the pitch for what is Scholar?
Yeah, so my general background in game dev is I don't have one. This project basically came out of pure passion and just being very headstrong. Like I literally had to look up tutorials on how to program online until I finally learned enough and created Scholar. Um, Scholar of the Arcane Arts was born because it's basically a roguelike, and the goal is to actually make you feel like a wizard. It's action based, but the mechanics can almost be seen as like turn based or a deck builder. So you'll be casting spells and in real time combining those spells as they fire out from your wizard to have powerful combos and defeat big bosses with their own unique mechanics.
Mm-hmm. And I was looking at the store page just before I'm like kind of scanning it right now. So a big aspect of the game and kind of what we'll probably be focusing a lot of our discussion on is the idea of like combining the different spells into various properties. And I guess kind of like what is that about in this game?
Yeah, so that is the big hook of the game. The fun of the game is finding how different spells interact with each other, and then just basically having the perfect hand of spells that work nicely. So, in an example of that would be is there's a spell that you can throw vines and thorns on the ground, which will deal damage over time. However, if you shoot a fire spell at them, they catch on fire and do extra damage. If you shoot them with the water spell, they grow out, and the vines will wrap up enemies and hold them in place. And it's these kind of combinations that is the backbone of the game.
And that's definitely an interesting approach. And it's something that I've thought about like as a project or as a concept a long time ago about having like these different aspects you can combine and tweak in order to create like special attacks or enhance their properties. And you said about a minute ago that this is kind of your first actual game dev project. When did you start first making Scholar?
I started back in February of 2021. I had it. It started basically. I wanted to learn game dev. That was my COVID project. I was like, you know what? I've loved games my whole life. I think I can make a good game. Time to put money where my mouth is. And I started it and just got addicted to it. I could not stop. And yeah, 2 years later, I had met up with the publisher ES Digital. We had the whole pitch meeting. They liked it, and now it's out in early access. And I'm still pinching myself. Can't believe it happened.
Nice. What engine are you using for Scholar?
I'm using Unity, and the reason I picked Unity is a very meticulously researched. I basically YouTubed game dev tutorials, and whatever had the most feedback or the most tutorials show up, I was like, great, I'll use that engine.
Yep, and I mean, Unity is certainly like the workhorse when it comes to indie dev. And before I forget to mention, for anyone watching us live right now, if you do have any questions or comments for Endo, be sure to type them in, and I'll read them off as they show up. But yeah, like Unity has definitely been, I think, very pivotal in terms of getting new people into game dev, and even just not just Unity, but of course just the rise of more public game engines over the past decade.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, their model is very inviting, right? Where it's like it's free unless you actually like make a hit, then you can start paying the subscription. So there's very little cost of entry, which is huge. And also
Mhm.
the asset store that it has. Yeah, it wasn't as scary as learning some of the more maybe complicated engines.
And I guess as a new developer, or as like relatively young in your indie dev career, how was it? Like you just said, it wasn't as hard as you thought, but like for any like students or enthusiasts watching, like how was it kind of going from no game dev experience to learning Unity?
Um, so I guess I should preface saying like it was easier than the other engines, but it was still very, very difficult. I remember there was a point when I was making the game where I had thought like if I wanted to create a system for the game and there wasn't like a tutorial online for it, well, I just had to forget about that idea because if someone couldn't walk me through it
Hmm.
at the beginning steps, I wouldn't be able to do it. It was incredible. There was many moments along the path where I almost quit and had like self-reflective moments of like maybe I'm not as smart as I thought I was because I'd never pushed myself. Programming really pushed me to a place that I haven't challenged myself before.
Hmm. And it is certainly a challenge, especially for any new people watching us right now, in terms of trying to learn not only while you're trying to build what your game is, but also learn the tools you're going to be using for said building.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that helped me, and I know this advice is given out so much and it's because it works. The thing that helped me was I actually took a break from working on Scholar and I gave myself 2 weeks and I was like, you know what? I'm going to make an endless runner front to back, just like a little car driving and then you hop on different ledges and publish it on Google Play. And in those 2 weeks, I learned more than I did in like 3 or 4 months of developing the game.
Hmm. Yep, and it's also why for a lot of developers, it's important to like kind of work on like smaller projects, as the ever popular term "fail small," to kind of just use that as a test bed to build your knowledge before you really go all in on whatever your main product is going to be as a studio.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that's why we're seeing game jams becoming more and more popular.
Hmm. So with the Scholar, in terms of the design of it, like what attracted you to making this game as kind of like your first major project?
If you're, I'm not sure if you're a Marvel fan, but if there's a scene in Infinity War where Thanos is fighting Doctor Strange, and they basically are two wizards fighting each other, right? They're casting spells and they're not dodging out of the way. They're like countering and reacting to the spell that is cast. And I
Hmm.
remember seeing that and it was like, man, I want a game that makes me feel like that. Um, the closest I'd ever gone to that is Divinity Original Sin 2 with its whole magic system and how they react with each other, but I had wanted it in real time too, and that's where I was like, you know what? I'm gonna try it. I'm gonna try and make it my own.
Yep. And with like that kind of magic system, like you already mentioned kind of like how spells and stuff combine. So one of the things that we were kind of discussing before we came on for this cast, and kind of like as one of some of the topics, was the I guess like kind of like almost like emergent gameplay, or even kind of like immersive sim aspect that you were kind of approaching with it. And I wanted to kind of talk more about that because when we look at kind of immersive sim design, and again, like that in of itself is like a good hour, 2 hour long topic. It is very hard, I think, for a lot of people to kind of grasp what that means from a design standpoint. And as someone who's obviously working on a game that's built around that, I want to kind of ask, like, what are your thoughts when it comes to like immersive sim or emergent game design?
Yeah, so it's definitely hard to create, especially as like, a solo dev, because immersive sim is so many systems. But I think the important part about it is it doesn't have to actually be a full simulation. It just has to feel like it is. So like the example earlier when I said like you throw thorns on the ground and if you shoot a fireball at it, the player kind of expects for it to catch on fire, right? Now it doesn't mean that I've simulated every grass and every blade in the game. It's just like it just feels right. And I think that's the trick to immersive sims. It meets expectations, but almost surprises you that it does meet expectations. I think Breath of the Wild is like a great example of that.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and it was a topic I think I talked about a very long time ago, or I probably have talked about immersive sims frequently, or at least multiple times over the last few years. And as you said, it's not about this kind of we're going to make this game ultra super realistic. It's about creating very established rules and then kind of letting them follow kind of like the logical course of it. If I have a fire spell and this enemy's made out of wood, I will expect this guy to get set on fire by him with a fireball spell. Conversely, if I throw fire at another fire enemy, I'm not expecting him to get hurt by that. I'm expecting him to just kind of like laugh that off. And it's when we, as you said, like it's when we get to these kinds of like interactions between these different effects that it's where the immersive sim and this emergent gameplay can really make or break. And with Scholar, and for people watching who haven't had a chance to look at the store page, like how many like spells or how many like I guess modifiers or variables are you dealing with?
Yeah, so the way that I've tackled it, because it can spiral out of control very quickly. So instead of doing that, each spell can combine with each spell uniquely. There's like 5 schools of magic, like fire, earth, water, lightning, and necromancy. Each spell basically has 5 modifiers depending on
Okay.
which school it interacts with. Because otherwise, I'll never release the game.
Yeah, it would
As
just yeah. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, in today's build that's out now in early access, there are 50 different spells. Could you imagine having to make 50 unique interactions with each spell?
Yep, and of course, the game being a roguelike means that you're also dealing with procedurally generated environments and that kind of thing. And it's also one of the reasons why a lot of developers say you don't want to work on Proc Gen as your first game, because it can be very maddening in terms of just how big it can get. And I have to say, like, you say you started working on this in 2020, and then you kind of released your first build in, you said 2021 or 2022 was it release?
2021 was when I first started it,
Okay,
and then
and
I had like the testing but like testing like just with friends, maybe in
mhm,
the first 6 months,
okay.
and now we're here today.
Yep. So, I mean, as a new developer, like that's a very like quick turnaround of starting development, especially with someone that has a lot of high concepts like this. So, as like a new developer, I definitely want to get your thoughts on working with Proc Gen, because procedural generation is another aspect that I think a lot of people will either not give enough credit or they'll kind of like downplay saying, "Oh, it's very easy. Just let the type a few things in, let the game do its thing, and hey, it makes a game for you." But as I'm saying this, every indie developer who work with Proc Gen right now is like staring daggers at the screen, like looking at me. So again, like with this being your first project and your first kind of exposure or use of procedural generation, how was it kind of like grasping the concept and working on it for Scholar?
It was honestly a nightmare to understand. It took me forever, and there was even a point too where I was just, before I fully understood the system, I was using the ProcGen system through a tutorial I'd found online, and it just wasn't doing what I wanted it to. Um, Understanding procedural generation, I think, is ex- way more difficult than just creating levels. However, once you've got a full grasp on it, it makes the development of the game so much easier. Because now I can, like, when I make a new world, I have the code and I just have to build the art assets, and the proc gen will make it for me. It's just
Mhm.
getting to that level where you understand the proc gen and making it do what you want to do.
Yep, and kind of creating like the rule set or the algorithm that you want the game to kind of use as the blueprint. And like as you said, like that is oftentimes one of the harder aspects of grasp, and it's something that I've seen a lot of indie devs, especially like newcomers, tend to struggle with. Is this idea that if we just let the AI make everything, it just becomes this chaotic mess where there's
Mhm.
no structure, there's no real sense of flow, and it's why for a lot of developers there's still that argument over whether proc gen can necessarily, or if it could, replace a handmade level. And honestly, I would say that proc gen is more or less like a separate kind of philosophy. That's a separate tool that you can use. Because a handmade level has its own unique advantages and disadvantages, just as procedural generation can.
I 100% agree with that. In fact, there's sometimes I'm think for future additions to the game, I'm going to be mixing and matching. Some dungeons will be handmade and some will be proc gen. Because with the handmade, you can add, um, you can handle like the escalation and drive the experience, make it more curated.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the proc gen, it's like, like, boy, I hope you had a good run. It's a roguelike. Oops.
Mm-hmm. And especially if you're trying to teach someone, like proc gen
Mhm.
makes it a little bit hard to provide like a proper lesson. When again, it can just spawn anything. So I guess to build off of that is my next question for you. In terms of the procedural generation for Scholar, like I guess in outside of the spells, I guess what is like the world design like? What is being procedurally generated when someone creates or starts a run of the game?
Yeah, so I have basically two systems built out of the proc gen. Actually, I did want to comment on your what you had said earlier, real quick.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying if like you wanted to guide or teach the player something. That's a great instance where the tutorial levels in Scholar completely handcrafted
Yeah.
because you can't do that with proc gen,
Mm-hmm.
or at least not the level that I know it. Um, for what I'm actually making with the proc gen, there's basically two archetypes currently. There's the open worlds that I'm building, and then there's the dungeon layouts, and those are using two different systems. So the open worlds is basically like it's a top down game, so it's a big chunk, and I am throwing in obviously enemies and like background art assets, and then what I'm calling point of interests. And the point of
Mm-hmm.
interest before they're spawned, they kind of talk to each other. They say like, "What's your chance of spawning? Has the player done enough to see this point of interest yet?" And then if those parameters are passed, then they spawn into the open world.
Mm-hmm. And yet, to Chris's comment in chat about like proc gen tons of levels as an idea, and then take the ones you like a bit and manually tweak them. That's something that I know a lot of larger studios do when it comes to open world design. That they will procedurally generate the general environment, general structure, and then when they have something they like, then they'll go in and then they'll okay, we want to make this handmade city over here, or let's alter this area here, and we'll throw some towers or some caves. And I remember when I interviewed Paul Ritchie and oh no, I'm forgetting his name, the other guy from Star Control. We were talking about how they had to use Proc Gen when they were originally coming up with the basic of the galaxy for the Star Control.
Yeah, I think we're gonna see it more and more. It's just like another tool in the toolkit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where instead of having to sit there and especially for open world games, like you said, instead of having to carve out each individual mountain peak,
Mm-hmm.
that can be done with an algorithm, and then you go in and fine tune it.
Mm-hmm. So, with Scholar, the other aspect, of course, we haven't touched on is that it does have rogue. It's obviously a roguelike and features roguelike design. What again, like with this being like your first game, you definitely chose a lot of complicated and advanced aspects as your first big title. What attracted you again to like working on a roguelike as your first big game?
Yeah, so that was another aspect of it's a very hard foundation to gain, but once I understood it, it made the process easier. So originally it was not going to be a roguelike. It was going to be a linear RPG. But with each world you can kind of like pop into. The issue I was finding is that with certain builds and certain spells combinations, they were just way outshining the other ones. So it would take so many hours to properly balance everything, make all the builds viable. Roguelike is like my get out of jail free card where I could be like, okay, well, that run was nuts, but you may not get that combination again. Let the player enjoy being overpowered sometimes, and sometimes the player's underpowered. It's almost like a cheat.
I just finished writing my book on RPG design. I spend like a small book within the book talking about balance and just how much of a nightmare it is when you have 50, 80 different spells and you need to make sure each and every one is 100% viable in a linear game, or you're going to have that one situation where that one person chose the one spell you didn't balance and realize that your game doesn't work.
Yeah, 100%. That's because that's how and you had I think you touched on this on your latest video too about the creating interesting choices
Mhm.
where the player will not completely restart the game and just be
Cool.
like, okay, that didn't work. They'll just be like, no, this game's not balanced. Why didn't the spells I want to work? It's the developer's fault. Which I mean, to a case, it is.
hmm And a comment from Hazok's fan of Land Butcher said, "Love you, Endo."
Love you too, buddy.
And with kind of going the roguelike aspect with it, does the game, I was looking at the store page again, is there like persistent elements or, things that carry over from run to run?
Yeah, so that's I think a lesson that I think the industry is leaning towards more roguelite than roguelike.
Mm-hmm.
Especially with games like Hades and Cult of the Lamb. There's I personally didn't want to make a roguelike because I know I enjoy feeling progression in the games that I make or the
Mm-hmm.
games that I play. So I've been trying to find ways to add progression to Scholar that's not meta progression. I want the game to be able to be beaten on the first run if you have the knowledge on how to do it. I don't want there to ever be like okay, I have to level up my character's strength enough before I finish the game. So what I'm doing instead is the concept of the game is that there's you're being invaded by all the evil gods, and all the villagers have gone into the world to try and fight them, but they're getting beaten up. The progression of the game is going out there. Once you find a villager, they come back to town, kind of like
Mm-hmm.
Cult of the Lamb, and they stay in town for all future runs. And they'll give you like little bonuses, but nothing that's too impactful in the gameplay.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and the roguelite aspects. I have to make sure I get that right, or I'll get people yelling at me. It is definitely one of those aspects that has grown as kind of roguelikes in general have become more popularized and mainstream over the last decade. And it is a tough line to walk because I have played plenty of roguelites that have it like your first run, no, you're just never going to win. Like, you literally don't have any tools that you're going to be able to use to succeed. And it is that tough line because the progression is very addicting. That idea that, hey, now my guy starts with 20 more damage or 30 more magic points more than when we first started. But it can be that tough line to walk in terms of just, what does run one look like? And I guess that's a question for you as well. Like with Scholar and with building the game, like how did you kind of think about what does like the very first run of this game is going to look like to someone when they pick it up?
Yeah, that's so one of the hardest things about Scholar for the first run is basically having to unteach players lessons they've learned from every other action roguelike. Every other player goes in and they're used to like Enter the Gungeon and games like that where they're like, I should be spamming one attack constantly and I should be dodging the enemy's attacks, like with the dodge roll or something. And Scholar, it's you should be combining all your spells, and then you shouldn't be moving out of the way of spells. You should be using defensive spells, like putting up walls to block
Hmm.
attacks and things like that. So for the first run, with the tutorial, I made sure to almost overpower the player, and all the spells they pick up rely a lot on combining them.
Mm. And
Typically, I'm still struggling to get the new players to be like, oh, okay, I should be combining spells.
mm. And I'm looking at the screenshots for the game right now. So the kind of like the background of the spell, is that kind of like what you're using to like give the player like the idea like this, what school or what like magic class the spell belongs to?
Oh yeah, so they like if it's like blue or red
Mm-hmm.
or green, yeah.
Mm. Yeah, again, it's a very tough problem because if the player does like one of the things that we have seen, I'm sure you're well aware from playtesting, is that when the player does something that looks good, even though it may not necessarily be the right thing, they're going to think that is the best way to play. Like if I shoot giant fireball and it kills an enemy, well, I'm just going to spam giant fireball. But then what happens when you run into that enemy who a giant fireball just does nothing to them, and they're just sitting there going, "Well, the game taught me nothing, so it must be the developer's fault. Why am I not killing this guy with a giant fireball?"
Yeah, it's definitely and then the other issue too of going so originally I had gone too far in the other direction. So like you start with a fireball and I'd made the cooldown of the first fireball you get really long to try and like nudge the player of like use
Mm.
other spells, use those other spells. And still they would refuse. They would sit there, wait for the cooldown, and just be like, man, this game does not feel good. This game is too clunky or the timing's off. So it's a very hard balancing act to fix.
Mm-hmm. As you were describing that, it reminded me a lot of Plants vs. Zombies when I saw that presentation by George Fan about how much work he and his team did to get the onboarding and the feel right of the game to make it so simple to learn while still having that depth. And it's a very tricky to kind of train someone to learn mastery like that. It's a topic I've been thinking about a lot more lately since I've finished off Pizza Tower. This idea of
Mm.
how do you get the player from here to there to now there? Like some people, like your hardcore fans, they're going to learn your game inside and out every which way, no matter what you do. But even with a game like Pizza Tower, and even with other roguelikes and roguelites I play, I always scan the achievement rates to spot like churn. And in almost every circumstance, a good 20 to 30% of the people who bought the game, they check out maybe within like 1 to 2 runs or even less than that. They just, they play and like, okay, I die, that's it, game over, uninstall, never playing it again.
Yeah, it's almost scary, right? Because you have to hook them instantly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other, to be completely self-aware, the other difficulty that I've had with my game is so I'm the solo dev, I'm doing the programming and the art. I'm not an artist, as you can see from the store page. The art is pretty simple,
Mm-hmm.
and I think when a player sees a game like that with simple art, they're not going to think, "Oh, but it's going to have really in-depth mechanics. I should give it some time."
Oh, yes. I mean, we can talk about, I'm sure every developer watching this can certainly talk about the horror of how much a strong aesthetic is pretty much required, I think, for a lot of games these days, especially when on one of my other shows we do here, I review Steam store pages. And good art, good thumbnails, a really good trailer will oftentimes sell a game even if the gameplay is not at that same level. And sometimes all it takes is that one really good GIF of your game. That one, okay, I shoot the spell and it explodes and everything, gets electrified and the enemy, takes 10,000 points of damage. And you can just put that on like TikTok or on Twitter and everyone's like, oh, look at all this. But again, if you're not averse in art, it can be very hard to get something to that level.
Yeah, absolutely. That's been the biggest hurdle. One thing that has helped with that is there's been a couple streamers who have taken a chance on it, and there's a little bit of like a snowball effect happening now that we're seeing with the game. Of they're like, hey, if they're almost vetting it for all the players of like, hey, ignore the art. There's actually something deep here, and we're seeing stronger responses from whenever a streamer plays it.
And you let me to check out the game. I'm always looking for submissions for my Wednesday night shows. And yeah, like for someone like me, like I've been around long enough that, good, bad, or indifferent art, I will still check out a game. And it is, again, like that kind of hard sell. And what you just said about how indies can kind of streamers and content creators can vet these games has been, I think, another major aspect of how video game coverage has changed for the past 10 years.
Yeah, it's to the point where one streamer is worth like 10 to 20 articles of coverage. It's pretty incredible because I think a lot of it is, you want to. So, for instance, that perfect gift that you were talking about, to like really sell the game, it's the streamer can convey an emotion that like journalism has, I think, a little more trouble doing. So we had a GIF that went viral for a bit because we had a streamer playing the game and he realized, like, after playing it for an hour, that you could combine spells. Stopped what he was doing and just mouth dropped and looked at the camera like, what? I've been doing this wrong the whole time. That just lit a fire under the social media.
And I'll get to Hazok's question in a second. Regarding like onboarding the player, I guess one suggestion or one idea that I was just thinking about, maybe when someone casts a spell, because I'm looking at your like hotbar at the bottom of the screen, maybe like having spells that could fit, or spells that would work best, maybe like a little like highlight or like a little flash, something to like clue the player into, hey, I just launched this fireball. Why is whirlwind or something is like flashing down there for me to use, or some kind of indicator to like let the player know that, hey, something could happen if I use this. And again,
no, go ahead.
I was gonna say, it's always like those like little tricks sometimes you have to pull to kind of like train the player. I think one of my favorite lessons I've heard people say is that it's oftentimes like you're kind of using like sleight of hand, like you're tricking the player into thinking like, oh, they figured out that if I shoot a fireball into a group of plants that explodes and does multiple damage. But no, that's what I want to do. I wanted you to do that. I'm just making it seem like you figure it out on your own.
Yeah, that's we do have a portion of that in the. I say we, like I made it, but I say we. So I did a concept like that of like making them feel like they figured it out, but it was designed in the beginning of the tutorial where they find a new spell, it casts a wall of ice or a wall of water, and directly next they walk by and there's a bunch of turrets shooting fireballs. It's like the classic tutorial thing. No words are spoken, and then the player always feels so smart of like, wait a second, I just found a spell that might be right here. Still working on trying to find a way for that connection to happen with combining offensive spells. And perhaps, maybe in the tutorial, having the UI blink of like, that's on the ground, shoot fire on it, it's going to be great.
I remember, as another example, something that kind of did something along those lines, the old... Oh man, I'm really hurting myself because I can't remember the exact name of it. The Marvel, what was it, like, not Ultimate Alliance, the Marvel games where you could have been Alliance, where you had like the different like Marvel characters like teaming up and you was like an ARPG. So you had like the different superheroes doing their attacks. So like when you had that combination, it would like flash on screen like whatever like fancy name they used for, Spider-Man teaming up with the Hulk, or Cyclops with Magneto, or whatever the heck you wanted to do. Marvel Ultimate Alliance, thank you. I'm glad that my encyclopedia brain remembered that. And yet, it's, again, like, always that very... excuse me. It's that challenge of trying to get someone. This is, again, like to bring this back to the immersive sim and emergent game design group, it's very hard to get someone to look beyond like the basic idea. I know like Arcane has probably struggled with this for probably over a decade now with their games, because again, like There are people who play a game like Prey or Dishonor, like, okay, I get a teleport spell. Well, I'm just going to use this teleport spell. Is that like a firebolt? No, I don't care about that. I'm just going to teleport around. And then they get to that situation of, well, my teleport doesn't work. The game's over. I have no other tool to use.
Right. Because they've been relying on it so much. Yes, absolutely. I think another one who's good that comes to mind is like a masterclass of teaching how an immersive sim works is Half-Life 2. When it came out, that there was no real like physics like that in a game before, and just the way they set up the world, which to our previous conversation you can't do with proc gen, of like, hey, here is what do you think should work here, and it does, and then you're like, oh, okay, this opens the door.
I still remember that first time I did the waterway pulse. We had to take the barrels, put it down so it like bounces like the ramp, so you can like take your hovercraft across that. And I mean, again, like, we talk about this now as oh, you just do the thing and makes it work. But back in 2004, or whenever, however many years that could have been, it was such like that strange concept of trying to make this world seem like what you're doing in it can work. And again, it goes back to the idea of emergent gameplay. That if this thing is made out of water, if it's ice, and I shoot out water, it should freeze the water. Then what can I do with that? And like as we were saying at the beginning, in terms of trying to make this expand out, but not drive yourself crazy doing it, you have to think about like these kinds of like rules that you want your world to abide by, and then figure out just, okay, how do all my stuff kind of affect that? If this is a world where characters fly, if I have a gravity spell, I can pull them down. Or maybe I can use gravity and, turn a rock into, like, its own, like, anti-air. Just launch that rock at someone. And, like, again, like, I can just sit here and just dream up emergent game examples for, like, the next hour if people want me to do that.
You basically described my past 2 years, where I go to bed at night and I'm thinking of like, well, what if they had a spell that did this? What if they had a spell that did that? It's very addicting. It's a lot of fun.
Yep, and it's again like why like these kinds of designs really do attract a certain audience. Like there are, again, like for even Arcane, like I know there's people who probably don't touch anything from Arcane at all, but I'm sure there are fans who just eat that up. I have a few regulars, I'm not sure they're watching this now, but who love Dishonored 1 and 2, probably play that multiple times. And it is, like we've said, like, it all kind of goes back to that kind of, like, marketing, or, showing someone that's possible. Because, your example earlier about the streamer who kind of had, like, the deer in the headlights moment, I think I had one of those when I was playing a few strategy games last year. Like, depending upon like who's playing the game can greatly affect what kind of element or what are they actually showcasing. Because if you put your game, or you put a game like this in front of someone who doesn't know anything of what they're doing, they could easily like poison the well in terms of this game, saying, oh, this game is stupid, why am I always dying, why are none of the spells working? And conversely, as you said, you can put in front of someone's like, oh my god, I've been doing wrong, the spells are working, look at what I can do now. And it has been, like, again, like, the song and dance of, finding influencers and content creators to cover your game is in of itself its own unique nightmare when it comes to the game industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you were saying about having it like a click, we've seen, like Steam, you can see the metrics of playtimes. It's a giant U. It's either the player will give up after 15 minutes, or we have people logging 70, 100 hours into the game. And it's like, okay, can we like kind of push it over a little bit? But that's kind of the struggle of of teaching what is possible in a game and how it not should be played, but where we think the fun is.
And getting people over that finish line. I mean, just over like getting them past a starting gate is why this is very difficult to do. And I guess to kind of put that into a question for you, what has it been like designing the tutorial? Like, I'm sure you probably have designed like multiple versions, or you've probably thought of multiple revisions of it by now.
Oh yeah. So at first there was little to no tutorial. I came in because again, this is my first game ever. I was like, I'm gonna be like Dark Souls. I'm gonna punish the player if they don't learn on their own. And then I realized that that's a miserable experience. So that's when I added the tutorial, and it's been like we had talked about earlier, a little the balancing act of where I don't want to be too heavy-handed, because I also can tell from watching the playtest, the fun of the game comes when the player discovers the combinations themselves, but trying to nudge them towards the right answer. I've actually updated the tutorial recently to the point where the first 3 spells that the player finds, you have like a little book that'll come out and tell you of like, hey, that said, it could be combined with other spells. Maybe try shooting a fireball at it. And then hands off again. Being like, let's see if they do it again. And then if they don't combine it, the next spell's like, hey, this one also could be combined. What are you doing? Combine it.
And yeah, like, it's that difficulty when it comes to onboarding that I've played tutorials where it feels like I'm just attending a school lesson. Okay, go over here, click on this. Okay, you got this. Now go over here, use it on that. Good job. Go through this door, hit the button, and I can just feel my eyes starting to glaze over. And again, like, I've watched churn rates of games where it's like, okay, it's like 99% started the game, 20% actually finished the tutorial or the very first mission. And as you say, like, on the other end of it, with something like a Dark Souls or Souls-like kind of game, a lot of people, I think, misconstrue, just like, while it's not guiding, or it's not like hand-holding, there is still that semblance of a path in terms of onboarding the player in a Souls-like, that if you're not, like, if you don't understand design, it's very easy to miss that. But these games oftentimes do a very subtle job of guiding the player at least through, the basics, like, step 0 to step 1. And when it comes to onboarding, like, that's what I think every game needs. Like, you need to have that step 0 and step 1, because you're always going to have someone who's never touched that genre, who has never looked at it, and they'll be like, what the hell is this? Like, what is this? Like, what are all these icons at the bottom of my screen? And like, for me, like, that's like the grand strategy genre for me in a nutshell. Like, I cannot learn that genre because it just feels very hard if you haven't grown up playing that to then just jump into something like a Stellaris or Europa Universalis.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. I think those are probably the hardest to create that onboarding experience for, because, like you said too, so um, the if you handhold too much, you're actually not training the player or teaching the player, and you're boring them. It's like the worst of both worlds. So we have a system in the game, or a mechanic, where a defensive spell needs to be a certain level higher than an offensive spell, or it won't work. It's a little complicated because it's not used in too many games before. It's a new idea. So the way that we do it is the enemy puts up a defensive wall, and you can't get past that wall till you upgrade your offensive spell to understand the concept of defense versus offense. The very next part, the enemy is shooting spells at you that are stronger than your defensive wall. And then we see like that kind of click of like, oh, okay, I could see that level of the spell they're attacking. I just did it in reverse before. And we kind of guide the player of like, do you see what you have to do here? You have to upgrade your defensive, go back and do that now.
As you were describing that, it reminded me a lot of when I play a lot of these Actronics games, or the kind of like programming puzzle style stuff, where it's that very same concept of, okay, we're going to tell you, okay, this door needs a blue key. Okay, let me get that blue key. Now we have a door that, let's say you need to actually create that key, and it's colored yellow. Well, I need to make a key works, but the door is yellow. Let me combine that, or let me print a yellow key and go like that. And again, like, as I'm saying this, like, to some people out there, you're probably thinking that I'm making this sound so elementary. This is like kindergarten level design. But there are people who have never passed the opening level in a Zachtronics game, who have never even finished, like the ones just literally, okay, we're giving it all to you. Just put this one arrow here, and the puzzle solves itself. And again, like, we can sit here till the cows come home in terms of how hard it is sometimes to get that player to think outside of their own, like, biases when it comes to these designs.
Yeah, and like again in the tutorial to build again on top of that the on player biases. Like I had said, it's also been a struggle to teach the player to stop dodging attacks, counter them instead. So we purposely, or the royal we, purposely built enough turrets that they clearly cannot run past. If they try to get one shot. To also, and it's important to one shot the player to death to let them know there is no possible. It's not like you did the dodge wrong. It's just 100% incorrect. Do not try that.
And that is a really good point there, because in a lot of games that combine elements like this, it's sometimes hard for the player to understand where is the failure. Like, you know, as a example from a lot of puzzle platformers, it's kind of like, am I doing this wrong? As in terms of, am I not platforming right? Or do I literally not have the right solution? And I need to figure that out. And again, it's very hard to get someone, or to get them to figure out why something is wrong. Like, and I think this goes back again to the kind of audience. Like, for someone like me, when I play a roguelite, it doesn't matter. Like, I will always try and analyze what I did wrong. Like, that is the very first thing that I come up with. But I know, I've seen, like, rage compilations and other, like, YouTubers and streamers who play games like this and are like, oh, the game broke, or, you know, it's the game's fault that I got hit here. You know, why can't I dodge? Or why is my fireball not killing this guy? It's the game's fault. The game is stupid because I can't win.
Yeah, and like the puzzle platformer example, right? It's if the puzzle platformer is set up properly, the player should not just barely miss the platform. They got to push the platform way out, so the player's like, "There's no way I can get that. It has to be a different mechanic."
Exactly. And again, like, I was just playing another game the other night, like, for people watching live, Rust and Moss, which is kind of like using grapple physics. And it's that difference between, as you said, like, if this is the edge and I go, like, right here, I'm going to assume, okay, maybe I didn't jump right. Maybe I can spend a few more minutes and try to do it. But if the platform's here and I'm only ending up, like, over there, I know that, okay, you know, I can't do this now. Like, it's not happening. Like, there's no trickery of, like, if this is as far as I can go, that's going to make me go over here.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and that's I think that's probably where a lot of those rage things happen, where people are like, "It was just barely working before. Why isn't it working now?"
Oh, yes, and if we get on, like, RNG and trying to teach someone about probability, that's a lot of developers, again, I think, are having a chest pains as I'm bringing that topic up. Now, before I forget, I want to go back to Hazak's question, because they asked this a while ago. They wanted to ask, where did you draw your creative inspiration from in terms of, like, aesthetics, environment, story, and NPC design?
Yeah, so when I first started, I was obsessed with a game called Hyper Light Drifter. I just absolutely love that art style. So I tried to gain inspiration from that for the aesthetics. I something again because I'm limited in art. What I found was important to do was consistency. I think consistency can sometimes be more important than actual art talent. So as long as everything still looks the same, um, or you don't have like, oh, the main character's hyper detailed and the enemies like look like squares. That's just weird and off putting. So that's where I drew a lot of my aesthetic design choice. It's like, how good could I make hyper light drifter type of art and also release the game before I die?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like one of the like biggest like traps I think for a lot of developers, or one of the biggest things that can sink a game, is when you have that kind of like mismatch art, where it's
Mhm.
like, here's this ultra realistic portrait, here's a super like here's a block for a character, and then we have a background that's maybe all like voxel base. Like when
Mhm.
things don't look like they match, I think that does hurt the appeal of this game. And again, it's something that has to be conveyed well in good trailers and screenshots. That you want your game to look like, there's been thought and care put into it. Whether you're working on, ultra 4K HD graphics, or you're just doing simple 1 to 2 bit pixel art.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, even look at a game like Thomas Was Alone. It's just
Mm-hmm.
a bunch of squares and shapes, but the style is consistent throughout, and your mind immediately accepts it.
Yep, exactly. Let's see. Now, with a Scholar, I'm trying to think of what else in terms of game design I was thinking of. So we were talking about the onboarding and that kind of aspect. I guess to kind of build off of that, in terms of enemy designs, what has been kind of like your approach to designing or creating like the aspects of like what goes into an enemy?
Yeah, so the biggest thing for me was the bosses. I always feel like the bosses should be you should be slowly testing the player throughout the game, and then the boss is the final exam
Mm-hmm.
of do you understand the mechanics. So for instance, there's a big boss. I really want to make sure that the player understood that they have to use defensive spells they can't dodge. So one of the bosses is basically a giant bullet hell. That's you can't get out of the way of the spells, but if you put down a wall, you're very safe. There's another boss where they they crash down a giant meteor onto you, um, and you can destroy the meteor by shooting spells at it. However, if you're just shooting fireball with a long cooldown at the meteor, you'll never destroy it in time. You'll take huge damage. It's not until you start using your full hotbar that you are able to destroy that meteor in time. So that was kind of the thought process always behind the bosses. I wanted to create interesting mechanics, almost like you were playing a single player MMO of like, okay, I need to do this job and this job and this job. Now the boss is weak, and also the mechanics should reinforce or almost train the player on how to properly be a scholar.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking at these screenshots, so I see you have looks like 7 icons or 7 spells in the hotbar. Is that? I guess my question is that kind of fixed? Like, can the player get like more spells, or was that a hard limit set by you?
So the hotbar is fixed, but the player can swap them out at any time, even in mid fight, as long as the spell isn't on cooldown. And then yeah, and that's actually something where I'm like one of the villagers you find. You can destroy the spell, but take all the resources used to upgrade it to put it into another spell in case you wanted to pivot the build or try something new. Um, but yeah, so that's why like at the beginning of the our chat, I said like I almost vision it as like a real time deck builder, and that hotbar is your deck or your hand. How are you gonna build your scholar?
Mm-hmm. And that is a very interesting coincidence because I was having this chat with a fan the other night. We were talking about like more action RPGs and more action games having like deck building influences or deck building style to them.
Yeah, I mean it's so fun to I think it's been such a successful genre because of synergy, right? If you having a synergy in a deck, it's addicting. So that's also where the spell combos came in of like, hey, these 7 spells are really working together. This is my deck. And also I get the twitch dopamine of oh, I'm shooting and I'm dodging and I'm using things in the right time.
In terms of, I guess, like the UX for like different spells and all that, as you were saying, like trying to come up with the different combinations, and you're kind of breaking it down to like each school has a different action with the other schools. For like the game, like can the player eventually like acquire like old like it's like how do they get more spells in? Let's start with that.
Yeah, so as the game, each enemy has a chance to drop a spell that they use.
Okay.
And there's also like treasure chests littered throughout with the proc gen that you can unlock, and you'll find either upgrades to the scholar with like health or like damage bonuses, or you'll find new spells. And then there's also like puzzles and challenges that also reward you with new spells. So you could eventually, if you keep looping runs, you could find every spell in the game.
Are these spells like categorized all by like a rarity system, or is like every spell kind of like I guess like just like its own like unique thing in that respect?
There is a rarity system that's like hidden from the player.
Mhm.
So they don't know, like they don't open it. It's not like Diablo where you'll see like, oh, this is a legendary spell or a rare spell. But there are some spells that I've just made like way too strong to start the game with, and you'll be one-shotting all the bosses. But like once you've worked up to it, and the enemies have scaled with you, it makes more sense to give it to the player now.
And I was looking again at the store page, and there's mentions of being able to like upgrade spells and make them more powerful along those lines. If you want a little bit more detail for that for people watching.
Yeah, so there's some there are two aspects to the spell, their power level and their cast time. When you first get a spell, there's like a essentially like a cast time where your character will move slower as they're channeling the spell, and then you can fire it. You can eventually remove that so you can fire it instantly. That's one upgrade, and then the other one is their power level, which affects each spell uniquely. So, for instance, one might make one spell every time you upgrade it, it makes the spell bigger. One might make you shoot more fireballs. It is though always a linear progression. So it's not like when I get my fireball to level 10, now it does something new. It's just like, oh, more damage or just more.
Okay. And in terms of inspirations, I have to ask this, like on the subject of combining spells, have you ever played a Magicka before?
No, but people always refer Magica to me when they hear about it. They're like, "Oh, this is just like almost like a physics-based Magica," even though there's like no real physics. Where yeah, people always the funny thing about the inspiration for the game. Originally, the game was going to be more of a parrying spell system, where you can see what the enemy's casting, and then you have to cast the correct thing. I never thought of combining the spells. And then I had my friend test it out, and he put the thorns on the ground, and he's like, "I kind of want to water my lawn." I was like, "I don't know what that means." He's like, "When I shoot water at it, I want it to grow bigger." I was like, "That's ridiculous, but sure, I'll do that." And then I made a new build; it could grow bigger. He's like, "Great, when I shoot fire at it, I want it to catch on fire." Like, okay, you're being obnoxious. Sure, just to make you happy, I'll do it. Then I gave that build to more friends. They stopped playing the game and they were just watering their lawn and setting it on fire. And it was at that moment I was like, wait a second, I think that's the hook. That's what I should build on.
People are very obsessed with watering their lawn, it seems.
It's shocking to me, but that's the game.
There you go. And as you were saying, like in terms of like having that unique hook, it really does lend itself into as Chris saying, like that kind of emergent design. And the comment Chris made earlier about something about that kind of play, or like the kind of like sandbox that you can get from emergent design, is one of its major like attractions. The idea again, like, hey, I hit this guy with a metal ball, and then I throw lightning at it, and the lightning, makes the metal electrified, and now it does all this crazy stuff. And trying to, like, have all these crazy combinations is such an interesting way of adding more elements to its toy, like as Chris says. That's, I think, a really good comparison there. And you never know, I think, as a designer sometimes, what part of your gameplay is really going to resonate with people? Like your friend could have easily have just said, you know what, I want, I don't know, make metal golems, or I just want to just make nukes all the time, and that could have gone in a very completely different direction.
Yeah, that's the I love that term, like toy like. If you can find something in the game that is toy like, then that's a success. That's a huge win. Um, and the combination thing has been so wild because there's, like I said, there's 50 spells, each one combined with a school of magic differently. But what happens is when you have the right build, you can just be filling the whole screen with spells. The most fun part of this process is when I see someone play it and find interactions that I didn't even think of or was possible. And as a developer, I sit there, I clench a little. I go, "Oh, is that broken? Did they just break the game? Is that bad?" And then I go back to it's a roguelike. It's okay. They can break it on this run.
Now, one, I think, possible problem with a game like this, I wanted to see if you thought about this. As you're saying with the idea of like having the different builds, sometimes it can be like, again, like pulling teeth to get someone to swap out a spell or swap out a combination. And I guess, are there like any like in-game incentives, or like, I guess, any ways that you're kind of trying to teach the player that, okay, you really like these 7 spells, but this guy right here, it's not working. So how do we get the player to say, okay, I may like this, but I need to swap it, or I need to take a spell out here, or even just completely throw out my quick bar and rebuild it?
Yeah, so there's been it's some trial and error with the players. Well, first off, when you're using the correct element against the correct enemy type, you get that big crit sign. And every player knows what crit means. They get excited and they're like, "Great, I'm going to keep doing that." And then the other part is the boss mechanics that I had taught before. And I've seen players, for instance, the boss that drops the giant meteor. Um, as they do multiple runs, they start thinking like, okay, I need an answer for that.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll look at their hotbar and be like, okay, this isn't it. This is good for the minions. I got to answer the boss there. So it's basically, I guess I've taken the approach of just beating them up until they understand.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess the other aspect too is that's what's nice about the roguelike is that you can't rely on a spell because you don't know if you're going to get it. At the start of each run, your spells are randomized. So you can't start with the same build again and go, okay, I'm going to try it, but harder this time. And then you also don't know what you're going to get out of the treasure chests.
And I think this is also where the advantage of it being kind of emergent does come in. Because you don't want to design an enemy or a boss that just says, I am completely immune to everything except for Poison Blast. Because if the player doesn't get Poison Blast, then they're just completely done. Like, there's no way they're going to win that. So by kind of tying to different offensive, different defensive spells, like we've said, like it's about giving the player these multiple answers. This guy likes to shoot a lot of bullets. What do I have that can block a lot of bullets, or shield me from a lot of bullets, or destroy a lot of bullets? And then kind of, hopefully, the player is making that connection from, A to B to C and so on.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's a failure of the game if I ever hear a player playing and they look at what they have before they go to the boss and they go, oh, this is a dead run. Because the player's immune, or the boss is immune to all my spells, or, you know?
Yep. And that, as we were saying earlier, with the idea of building choices, like that can easily be a game killer. That it's like, well, okay, I was having a lot of fun, and then the wall comes up, I got nothing to do, my run is entirely over. I mean, even games like Slay the Spire, which I really enjoy, have that same issue where you get the wrong boss for your build, you're done. Like that boss can hard counter you like nobody's business.
Yeah, that's the perfect example. And something that I've done to alleviate that too is that I had mentioned that enemies can drop spells. I always make sure that there's a spell in each dungeon that is an answer to the boss they're going to face. So even if they have the worst RNG, they're gonna find at least one answer correctly.
Mm-hmm. In terms of, I guess, in terms of world generation, I was looking at the sword page. So you mentioned you're going through like 3 different worlds in a run. Are the worlds themselves like completely procedurally generated, or is it kind of like you're going from one fixed biome, the next fixed biome, the next fixed biome?
Yeah, and we're actually up to 4 worlds,
Okay.
soon to be 5, but which I know. So we got to update the store page, right? Um, so the way that the worlds are generated is it's essentially there's a pool of enemies, a pool of encounters that the world can draw from, and you go into one world. Let's say it's the fire world. It's an open world. You find the dungeon. You go into the dungeon. You defeat the boss, and then you're automatically at the end of it teleported back home.
Mm-hmm.
You can upgrade, talk to your villagers, and then the next world is randomized. Which one you're going to go? Is it going to be the water world? Is it going to be the earth world? You go in through the run, and then that's kind of the loop. So it's not like it's one big world that's procedurally generated. They're basically just dungeons.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh, and as a quick time check for people watching, we are a little under an hour and 10 minutes. I figure we'll go maybe another 10 to 15 minutes if that works for you. And for chat, I think this will be kind of like first warning for final questions if you have any for Endo. Now, with kind of the building of, I guess, the difficulty, I mean, we haven't really touched on that all that much. We kind of danced around it a lot in terms of the emergent behavior and the immersive sim aspects. In terms of difficulty itself, like, what are you kind of like aiming for with Scholar? Like, in terms of, is this going to be easy, medium, hard, or, somewhere else?
Right. This isn't designed to be a rage game. It's difficult if you don't understand the mechanics and aren't doing it correctly. If you're sitting there just spamming fireball, you're never gonna beat it. If you're doing it correctly, it's the game is slower paced than other roguelikes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the monsters will run at you, but you're always faster than any monster that runs at you. The monsters that shoot spells at you, you can see them casting the spell and they stand still as they cast it. So you can react and you don't have to be like a god gamer, like, oh my god, he beat Scholar. Wow, he's a god gamer. It's just more of a, if you have the knowledge, it's beatable. And I always wanted it to be beatable.
One of the things I say a lot about games like this, that they're oftentimes like hard until they're not. That you
Mhm.
can have that kind of like breakthrough moment, you realize, oh, this is how things are supposed to work. Then the game kind of opens up. But as we spend like good, I think 30, 40 minutes of our chat on it, it's kind of very hard to get the player to get to that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. That is the difficulty with but I think those are the most fun, right? Because then that's when the light bulb comes on and you're like, oh, this is how it's supposed to be played. And then it's almost like, oh, now I can have fun. Now I can really flex my muscles.
Now the real game begins, as people love that line.
Right.
Now, one thing that I didn't ask, but in terms of the length, like, what does like the average run length of Scholar look like?
So if you were to play a full run, I believe it's about, I'm seeing between an hour and a half to 2 hours. It does save the progress though, so it's not like when you leave,
Mm-hmm.
it's a dead run. And then that's just to get to the final boss, get the credit scenes, and you're done. As far as like building up the town and unlocking new aspects, for for instance, there is actually going to be a deck builder in the game where monsters have a chance to drop their card. You can bring it back and then play a little card. It's almost like Gwent with Witcher 3, right? Um, so as far as that goes, I'm expecting maybe 30 to 40 hours of gameplay to fully upgrade and progress the town. And then there's people like there's this one streamer Logris who has put in 120 hours into the game so far. It's like I did not put in that much content, but he's having so much fun that he'll just keep looping it.
Yeah. And again, you never know when someone is going to just play your game to that level or not.
Yeah, it's. I mean, never would have imagined it. It's the greatest compliment I could receive.
And welcome, Pony, in chat. Let me see. I'm trying to think. I do want to ask you about kind of putting the game on early access. Before we get to that line of questions, anything else regarding the design, the art, anything along those lines that we didn't discuss yet for Scholar that you'd like to discuss?
Um, no, I think like it's been a great and thorough interview. I'm actually having so much fun with this, so I'm feeling good so far.
All right. Yeah, people tend to love like when I just like go all game design analysts on their games because we can. Those conversations can go for like 2 to 3 hours very easily.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else gameplay wise. We talked about procedural generation. I'll have like a few like final questions for you regarding like proc gen immersive sim, but we'll save that for like the outro or the end here. So let's talk a little bit about going on to early access because again, like for the people who are just joining, Endo here is a first-time developer. Like you do not have like a lengthy game dev background. What I guess when you first were starting to work on Scholar, did you have it in your mind to go on to early access or use early access when developing the game?
Yeah, absolutely. The best, the more feedback you can get, the better you can make your game, and that's been a big part of early access. There's been portions that when you're working on a game by yourself, like in your little dungeon, that you think are fun, or portions that you think that aren't fun, and putting on early access again, the feedback has been huge. The other important thing about early access is well, there's two major things. One is I also wanted to convey to my gamers that I'm going to be working on this and updating this for a long time. Now, if I just release the game, who knows, right? But if I put it on early access, I've done a major update every single month just to give him that idea of like, you know what, it's getting better. He's working on it. He's listening to us. We can invest in him because he's investing in us. That's been a great relationship to build. The other portion is with this crazy immersive sim magic combination thing. There's no way I was going to be able to find every
Yep.
crazy build out there. And that's been huge with early access.
Yeah, but as you just said that, my mind immediately went back to when I interviewed Tim Keenan, who did Duskers. This was like 5, 7 years ago at this point. There's like proc gen meets programming. And like he said, like very much that same thing. Like there is no way he or like a small team will be able to play test every inch of that. And as I'm sure you're well aware of, I'm sure Chad is as well. Gamers are really good at picking apart a game, especially if it's like any kind of immersive sim or emergent gameplay. They will figure everything out, whether you want them to or not.
We have it's on my YouTube channel. There's a pretty famous clip of I one of the bosses is basically supposed to be like a big tank. He's supposed to have a ton of HP, and a streamer one shot him with a build that I didn't even think was possible. so there is some tweaking, some fine tuning I had to do there for sure.
Now, from a game dev standpoint, working on like the early access timeframes, you said a second ago that you're releasing a major build each month. How has it been like from a production standpoint of having to kind of conceive, work, and release an update each month as a solo developer?
Yeah, so it's been pretty hectic. Luckily, I do have a good amount of time to work on it. What's nice is the community that I have so far also understands I'm a solo dev and understands, I'm doing my best. What's great about Scholar is that sometimes an update will just be a few spells, but adding a few spells to that immersive sim
Yep.
situation changes the game. Completely changes the game. I remember one update, I only added 2 spells, and everyone's build was completely different because that had opened up new doors for different strategies.
Yep. And that again is the one of the advantages of not only like immersive sim and immersive game design, but also roguelike design. Like when you add in like a new, like going back to our toy analogy, you add another toy to the toy box, it can greatly reverberate out. So you don't need, it's, as we said, like it's not so much about like saying here's a brand new handmade 20 minutes of content. It's more here's this cool new thing, or here's this new challenge that can show up, and how does that kind of I guess like merge, or like the melting pot into like the rest of your game.
Yeah, it's so exciting. And then one of the nice things too about the roguelike is they may have to take some time to find that spell.
Let's see. Chris asked, any suggestions or words of wisdom for other first-time releasers in terms of working on a game?
Sure. So I guess for me is if you're a solo dev with a first time release, you need to have other people who are either brutally honest or not your friend put their eyes on it. And secondly, ask them to record the gameplay or ask them to record themselves, because what they say and what they actually want are usually, or what they say and what they say and what they actually want are usually very different. um like for instance, like the dodge thing, when I first made it, everyone kept understanding the dodge, or kept asking for a dodge move. It was that I wasn't explaining the magic system well enough.
Yep, and like we said earlier, with the kind of onboarding there, that you have to kind of train the player as to what the game is going to be about. If your game is going to be very dodge centric or dodge focused, then that requires a different sense of pacing and a different onboarding compared to, say, if you want the player to be putting up defensive walls or using defensive spells.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing too about like the inspiration about the spell combos, which is why recording the gameplay is so important. Watch what they do. If they're sitting there watering the lawn, to put that in the game. That's the fun.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And like we said, like if they're getting stuck at a section or they're not figuring it out, then we need to tweak things or make them more apparent. If everyone figures something out very easily, then yeah, we don't need to spend 10 minutes training them on that. But like we said, like for any game that has like, and especially for immersive sim kind of design, if your game has a like unique selling point that no other game has, you need to onboard the heck out of it because no one's going to know about it because it's unique to your game.
Yeah, 100%.
Now, as you were saying a second ago, with the early access, you're working on this for the long haul. And let me get back to the story page. So you release it onto early access December of last year. Do you have like, have you given like any roadmaps or timetables for the game hitting 1.0, or do you see this as kind of like more of a long-term early access?
So it's going to be within the year, definitely. We'll be probably around, I don't know how much information I can give on it, but we'll just say like within the year, before we have like the firm date. And
Mhm.
then just continually supporting it. Like I said, this is something I think about before I go to bed every night. It's been so much fun to make, that it's the fact that my hobby is something that other people want to play is a dream come true.
Definitely. And I guess as a kind of a follow-up question for me, kind of along the same line Chris just asked, do you have any words of wisdom for approaching a game from a procedurally generated point of view, and then conversely, or as like a second question off of that, using or understanding immersive sim or emergent gameplay?
Yeah, so when you're coming from a procedurally generated point of view, you have to understand that it's not going to make your game interesting. There's You have to have elements that are exciting to discover. For me, what is great about procedural generation is that you don't know, the player doesn't know what exciting thing they're going to see next. But in order for that to be the case, you have to have exciting things in the game.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. So like interesting enemies, interesting puzzles, interesting events, that is really the core of it. The proc gen just makes it new for the player each time.
Yep, and that was something I said in my book when I was talking about roguelike design, that proc gen does not save a bad game. It doesn't take a bad experience and make it better. It just takes a bad experience and just randomly makes it bad, just randomizes the badness in it. And again, like, it's why it can be so tricky to think about proc gen along these lines. Because you need to have that blueprint in your mind as to what is this run? This is why I asked you earlier, like, what does a run of your game look like? Because if you can't answer that, then there's no way you're going to design an effective procedurally generated algorithm to have the game make that interesting run after run, play after play.
Yeah. So I guess to build on that, for to exactly what you were saying, make sure you have a fun game first, then add the project. Then then that way you can keep it fresher for a player who wants to play it nonstop.
And I guess for the second part of that question, then, in terms of the immersive sim or the emergent game design, again, like, when we're talking about this, so, like, this has been a fairly light chat, but these are oftentimes, like, very master level, very advanced topics when it comes to game design. For someone sitting there wondering what the heck we're talking about, or, like, how do you even begin to conceive this? Do you have any words of advice for approaching immersive sim or emergent design?
Uh, I I think especially if you're starting out with immersive sim, I like to think of it as like you're basically a magician, right? It's that you're pulling a rabbit out of the hat. The rabbit doesn't actually live in the hat, but the audience has to think it does. That's the important part with Sims. Like we were talking about earlier, like you don't want to simulate every blade of grass and every fire particle, but if a player wants to light the grass on fire, just make it feel right. Make things. I have to pause myself there too, but you also don't want to go too. Yeah, you don't want to go too hard into the sim because there's some spell combinations in the game that are a little weird, but just because um, they feel better for the player. So if I'm shooting, let's say for instance, I shoot uh, my fire spell at my ice spell. If it was a true sim, the ice spell would melt and it would ruin what you're trying to build. You don't have to go that hard. Make sure it's still fun.
Yep. And it's that challenge of, how much realism should you be thinking about? I always like the term, like, realistic fiction, that you want there to be rules, but then, the rules are there just to kind of, like, frame the enjoyment. Like, you don't, as you said, like, if I want to throw a rock at an enemy, I don't want the rock to be like, create a rock, falls to the ground, does no damage. No, I'm making that rock so I fling it at them like a volleyball or like my own personal catapult and hit that guy and send him flying. And as you said, like, it's the little, like, aesthetic details that can really add to it. Like when you there have been plenty of games where you play where it's like, I just launched this nuclear bomb at this wall, and then the wall looks perfectly fine. It's like,
Right.
okay, well, I just did that.
Right. Yeah. He definitely wanted to look and feel right. And like you're saying, you don't want just the rock. If it's too much of a sim, just go outside.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's still a game. You still want it to be fun, and
Yep.
the sim rules is what makes it fun.
Exactly. They're not there to kind of be like, like the teacher scolding you, saying, no, you can't do that. And like we were saying earlier with some of the examples, like, you never know what someone's going to figure out in terms of combinations, and that's where that fun lies. You want them to play around. You want them to try and make that electrified rock made out of lava that also does, like, triple shot and bounces around the room.
Yeah, and the I think a great reaction is when the player stops and goes, "That's broken." Like as long as they're not literally breaking the game, but they feel good about what they discovered.
You may you may want to be careful in giving me a key to check out, because I tend to break games in the not so friendly ways when I play them on streams, as people watching can attest to.
Oh, that honestly makes me want to give it to you more. That's great.
Yep, and like we were saying earlier, it's kind of like, as you said, it's that magic trick that you know fully well in a lot of cases what's going to happen. You want the player to think that you don't, that they know something that you don't know that's going to happen in your game. And like we said, like there's so much psychology that can go into this that we can spend another hour on easily.
Yeah, that's so my wife actually works in therapy and we have those conversations. It's like it's weird, like you have to actually get in their mind and make them feel good and make them feel like they did this.
Oh yes. And it also means understanding how does someone feel when they lose? Like how do you get them
Mm.
to, again, not just like pick up their computer and throw it out the window because they lost at a boss fight.
Yes.
And exactly, Pony, like good design is sometimes nigh invisible. Like if you do it right, most people will never spot good UI UX. If you do it wrong, your forum's going to be filled with people complaining in like 87 different ways as to why this game doesn't feel right. Why is it frustrating?
Yeah, I love that. I've also heard that said about tutorials. Is a good tutorial is one you don't remember.
Hmm. But I tend to remember because I tend to focus so much on UI UX with a lot of the stuff that I'm doing these days.
Hmm.
So I think with that, I am just about out of questions. I guess again, like as a one for you, Endo. Anything else that we did not touch on about a scholar here that you would like to bring up?
No, just hopefully everyone gets to try it, a chance to try it out, and I implore you to find the broken build that makes me clench.
All right. So with that, I think we'll kind of go into like our wrap up then, or kind of like our final set of questions. So I guess the first one, like as you just said, like you're planning on hopefully having something finished or being closer by the end of this year. Do you have any plans for the game to be on other platforms besides Steam?
Yes, we're going to be, and I can actually say we this time because it'll be the publisher is going to help me go on Switch, Xbox, and PlayStation.
Nice. And I guess as one question, I'm sure you've either thought about this or it's not even in your mind right now. Do you have any plans for after the game is released? Like, have you already started thinking about another title or another concept you would like to explore?
Yeah, so well, first I will take a very long nap, and then after that,
Hmm.
um, if I was to make a sequel for the game, immersive sim in proc gen isn't difficult enough, so I'd probably add multiplayer because I think the most fun it would be so fun to have people working together, combining their spells of like I'll cast this and you cast that, and that I'm sure will be another nightmare, but
I think
that
at
was
that,
always good.
I think at that point you will have no choice but to try out Magica. I think people will kind of like force you to do it then.
I mean, I actually have it on the. I have played it the single player a bit, so
Hmm.
yeah, I'll have to play it with multiplayer now just to see how it works.
A question just came from Chris. How is the publisher, and what are they kind of helping you with, from like a game dev standpoint?
Yeah, so the publisher is ES Digital. They've honestly been a dream, and I was worried at first to go with the publisher because you always hear the horror stories of
Hmm.
it. But they're helping me with, like, for instance, getting in contact with the streamers. They're translating the game. They have a whole QA department, which has been huge as a solo dev. So they go in and they find as much of the bugs as possible before we release out the new patch. Um, and just also having like a partner there. Like if I am questioning myself or need like another idea, I know that we both want success. So whatever answer they give is
Hmm.
only to our benefit.
And I guess as a follow up question from me, then, with as you were saying earlier, in terms of like pitching the game to the publisher, again, as a first time developer, what was that like? Kind of like building the pitch and actually like talking with them to get them interested in your game.
Yeah, that's I mean that's another reason why I've been so happy to work with them because if you think about it, they took a huge chance taking me on. I have no background. I'm just a guy with an idea. when I had pitched to them, I had a working build, and basically a PowerPoint of all the systems laid out, and they walked me through it. And they told me later part of why they signed was my own excitement. They could see, and I think I even told them, I was like, this game is getting made with or without a publisher. I have to do this. That kind of excitement and belief in what I was doing really helped.
Mm-hmm.
And then them seeing the spell combinations in action excited them. And they're like, you know what? We don't even truly understand it, but this is something new. We want to see it explored and fleshed out.
Yep, and I've spoken to several publishers and people who are more on like the publishing and PR side. And one of the things that I always get back from this, having something tangible that you can show them about your game is such a huge thing. Like, there's a difference between saying, hey, I have all these crazy ideas and it's going to be this and that and this and that, versus I have these crazy ideas. You can see them right here. I can show you this crazy combination of spells. And it also, I think, helps with building trust. That they know you're not just, throwing together all this crazy ideas like right, from your head. They know you've actually put something together, that you have actually thought about this to the point that you have put code to your computer to build something to show them.
Yeah, 100%. I would say if you don't have a playable vertical slice, don't even think about pitching yet. You have to show them, like you said, that it is something you can accomplish.
Exactly. And looks like we had a last minute join of Tomlin Bound saying, Endo, my boy.
Hey, Tom, how's it going? Glad to see you.
Let's see, anything else? So we talked about the publisher. We already mentioned about how important it is. You said you just started watching about 2 to 3 weeks ago. Like, for a lot of these conversations, like, there are casts where we just go for like 2 to 3 hours. Like, we just start like riffing on various design topics. But I think that is about it. If you are free in the future, I would love to have you come back on, especially talk more about kind of like what it was like to finish this game, and kind of, I guess, like, put that pin in the immersive sim and the proc gen aspects of it, like kind of like finalizing it.
Yeah, I would love to come back on. This has been a joy.
All right. So I think with that, to kind of end this cast on, first off, do you have any social media, anything you would like to like promote in terms of places people can find you, stuff like that, etc.?
Yeah, I've got a Discord full of scholars that I guess I'll maybe a link in the chat or something.
Sure, and I will include a link.
Perfect. That's the best place. I have a YouTube channel as well, but honestly, the Discord, I'm on a scary amount, so always reach out to me. And I'm happy to talk to anyone about either scholar or game design. It's just a topic I love.
And as I was just typing in chat, if for people watching, we have our own Discord and all that YouTubing stuff you can do down below, Twitter and all that in the corner. So with that, I guess my final question for you to end things on. Do you have any final thoughts, shouts to the fans, anything you'd like to kind of take us out on?
Yeah, definitely shout out to all the scholars in the Discord. And we have another Discord called Devloggers of Earth. They've been popping in. Just want to say hi to you guys too. Thanks for coming out for the support. And yeah, and I mean, like I said, I found your channel 3 weeks ago, and I've just been eating up every video as I work. It's been great.
I don't think the link work in YouTube. YouTube can be a little finicky with like links from outside, but I will include that for sure in the recorded version. So for the people watching this recorded, you should be finding everything down below if Future Josh did his job. So I think with that is going to do it for our interview. Again, Endo, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you, and I'm happy to talk with someone who really has kind of like gotten a really good handle as kind of their first major game dev. Because I have spoken to indie developers and students as well who they can sometimes get like in over their heads when it comes to that first project. And as we were saying, like, you did not make things easy for yourself as your first major project, going for immersive sim, proc gen, and roguelike all at the same time. So I'm sure in the future you've probably you'll do like MMO, Vampire Survivor, deck building, multiple choice ending as a title coming soon.
Yeah, oh yeah, MMO is definitely the next project and that'll be done in 6 months. No
As a
problem.
solo dev, I mean, it's easy, right?
It's easy as a solo dev. Yeah.
All right. So, with that, we are going to wrap things up for this cast. Again, for everyone new watching, thank you for tuning in. Do the liking, subscribing, YouTube algorithm friendly stuff. Again, you'll find links to all my stuff down below and up there. Join our Discord. And if you are a developer working on a project, you'd like me to take a look at it, or if you want to come on and chat about it or about anything with game dev, definitely reach out to me. I am available social media, send me an email, whatever. I'm always happy to chat with you. So, again, Endo, it has been a great pleasure chatting with you this afternoon, and I hope you have a really great or best of luck with the rest of the development.
Thank you so much, Josh, and thanks so much for having me on the show.
So with that said, everyone, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where you examine the art and science of games. And until our next chat, have a great night and a great weekend.